it's a very sharp reversal of the US position in relation to Russia and to this war. Previously, the Biden administration had put Ukraine at the center of its considerations and said that no negotiations would take place without Ukraine's participation. Trump has simply connected directly with Putin and has made clear that he and Putin intend to negotiate a deal to end this war, that they plan to meet in Saudi Arabia, and that 2 more summits may take place in the US and in Russia also, and that Ukraine is very much being sidelined in these discussions.
We also had the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth telling a NATO meeting that the US wouldn't contribute to a peacekeeping force and that Ukraine would probably have to accept the loss of territory. How have those comments gone down in Kyiv?
Yes, these are 2 big demands, actually, of Russia. That Putin has repeatedly said that part of his war goals are to ensure that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, and he has said that any settlement to this war should take account of what he calls realities on the ground, which is essentially Russian occupation of part of Ukraine. Both of those things clearly are very difficult for Ukraine to accept because they are defending their own territory and they are trying to ensure that they're protected in the future. And until now, at least, they've been encouraged in the idea that NATO membership is open to them. And it now seems from the Trump administration's position that this is not the case. So it's a very difficult pill for them to swallow.
One of the facts that we've been reporting on about this as well is a source telling us that European officials had no notice of this phone call happening. Looking at these developments more broadly, how worrying is this for Europe and its position on the future of Ukraine?
Yeah, Europe is learning a hard lesson that the Trump administration doesn't really care what it thinks. It's much more concerned with the application of power than perhaps in the past. And the perception is that Europe is not really able to generate much military power, and its economic power is divided because it can't agree very often a single position. And so they're facing the fact that the US doesn't very much care what they think, isn't really interested in having them as a partner in these discussions because Washington believes that it can deal directly with Putin, it can deal directly with China on other issues, for example, and it doesn't need Europe's support. So this is a very different position for Europe, and they're finding it quite hard to come together and assert themselves. They issued a statement yesterday saying that they believe that there could be no resolution to the war in Ukraine without Europe and without Ukraine, but it's hard to see how they leverage themselves into this discussion that Trump has begun directly with Russia.
Indeed, and also Scott Bessant presenting an economic strategy in Kyiv, which would involve essentially an exchange of some mineral wealth in Ukraine for US support. Our Big Take report today is looking at some of the costs involved in the future of this, particularly for Europe's major NATO members. The numbers from Bloomberg Economics protecting Ukraine and expanding those militaries could cost an extra $3.1 trillion over the next 10 years. How does that number add up?
Yes, it's a huge sum of money, and it's basically compiled from analyzing how much it would cost, for example, for Europe's NATO members to raise defense spending to something like 3.5% of GDP, which is far higher than it is now. It will be the cost of supporting Ukraine's military, both during the war and after the war, in ensuring that they have security guarantees. And it's the cost of reconstruction for Ukraine. There's a huge bill to fix all of the infrastructure and other industry and housing that's been destroyed in this war. So that's a very huge bill. It's another thing that the US is making clear that it believes Europe should shoulder the majority of the costs of. So it's a big question for Europe whether they can meet this kind of spending over the next decade.